Hey friends, welcome back to Paradigm Sherpas. Today we are talking about death. And our ferryman for this journey across the river Styx is the wise and powerful Dr. Gary Laderman. Dr. Laderman's been studying death for the majority of his life, and he's here to talk to us about why Americans are so obsessed with death. We look at Disney films, music. He talks to us about how the modern funeral practice really kicked off with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. We get into psychedelics and how they are emerging on the scene as a tool to help dying people relieve anxiety and hopefully have a better relationship and understanding of death as their imminent death approaches. And then finally, why we should all really try to consider death on a regular basis and how that can help us enrich our lives, live more creatively, have more meaningful relationships, leave as little on the table as possible, and basically have fewer regrets as we punch our one-way ticket out of existence. So with that, I will kick it over to today's Paradigm Sherpa, Dr. Gary Laderman. Let him introduce himself and get this thing going. Enjoy.
I'm just a teacher. I teach at Emory University in the Department of Religion, and I have a PhD in religious studies. Um, Not so interested in religion, but aspects of human experience that kind of arouse the religious imagination and religious sensibilities. So I started off focusing on death, uh, which I've written a few books about. But I have also focused in on questions around medicine and health. And more recently, I've been writing a book on drugs, religion and drugs. So that's a little bit of where I'm coming from in terms of a quick introduction.
Well, that's perfect, and I'm glad that you brought up what you're working on, as it relates to uh, religion and drugs, because that is something I'm super interested in as well. So maybe we can get a little sneak peek, or just learn a little bit about that as we go. But yeah, thank you for that initial introduction. I became, just so you're familiar, I became hip to your work through what's out there on the internet in terms of, we've done a lot of podcasts and things like that, but I've also read your work too, and most recently, Don't Think About Death. And I, it's it, I don't mean to be insensitive in a sense by saying this, but I had to chuckle slightly when I started reading the book, and I realized where the title came from in a way. Like, you at a very young age were, you know brought death became present in your life with the passing of your grandfather, right, in the house. And the way you talk about it in the book is that the rabbi came over to the house and tried to say to you, like, console you, basically, like, oh, don't think about death, think about, like, the richness of life. And it's like,
Yeah.
I think of all the times, like, a kid, a parent swears in front of a kid, and then they say, oh, don't do that, and then it's like locked into the kid's head forever. And it kind of seems like that was what happened with you. You were told, don't think about it, and then it sent you, maybe, keep me if I'm wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, but like on this trajectory of, like, really thinking about death and making it your life's work.
Well, yeah, that's definitely a good place to start. Really get into thinking about why I am thinking so much about death. Um,
Yeah.
but um, but you're right on, and certainly um, that trajectory only comes into view in retrospect. I certainly had no idea as a kid and teenager um, um, that somehow death would be the path for my life. Um, but in looking back and really what led me to write the memoir, but to begin as well with that story is um, because I often get asked the question, why did you choose to study death? You write books on it and teach about it. And so, over the years, that's sort of led me to try to reconstruct my life and death in my life, and that's sort of where that book came from. Um, but to your point, in looking back, absolutely, certainly somewhat of, I don't know if I call it typical, but a not uncommon Jewish perspective, you know,
Mhm.
focus on life, not on death or what happens after death and so on. I mean, although death is a feature of Jewish culture and religion, no doubt. Um, but still, from a young age of whatever it was, 8 or 9, it did implant in me this question, well, what about death? Why shouldn't I be thinking about it? And then certainly being in the environment of grief, don't no doubt with my parents who were struggling with the death of my dad's father. Um, and again, there too, we don't know how environments of grief shape us, but I think that they do have a profound effect on our life's trajectory.
No doubt, and especially when that happens at a young age, and especially when you see how your parents are affected too. Like I've gone through life experiences where I've seen aunts and uncles or grandparents pass, and it's one thing to deal with my grief of it, but it's a whole another thing when the people you look up to, um, and often think that they're invincible, how they become vulnerable and go through it. Well, that's definitely had an impact on me and got me personally thinking about death as I journey through life. Well, thank you
Yeah,
for addressing how you got started.
sure.
I I want to bring up what I think was a real eye opener for me as I started going through your work. I've always kind of been of the persuasion, um, which I now feel is incorrect based on, familiarizing myself with your work, that like death is taboo in American society. But you really helped me kind of realize, no, 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 no. It's everywhere. Maybe there are taboos with unpeeling the onion of why we're obsessed with death as a culture. But I'm wondering if maybe you could help everybody listening, understand what you mean with that perspective that American culture is really obsessed with death versus it being a taboo.
Yeah, it's a very different take on American culture and sort of death's presence in American society, because generally the conventional view is, Americans avoid death. Death is taboo, and we have an unhealthy relationship to it. That was really kick-started and took hold in terms of popular consciousness with the publication of one book in the 1960s, a famous book most people know who know, well, even if you don't study death, because it was so huge. It's called The American Way of Death by Jessica Mitford, and it was a attack on American funeral customs and articulated this notion again that was already in the air. Um, so yeah, my take is different. It's that yeah, we're obsessed with death. Uh, our attitudes are characterized by our more public collective attitudes are characterized by ambivalence and kind of simultaneous fascination, fixation on death, as well as a repulsion, distancing kind of relationship. So it's complicated, and I'll just quickly say, and we'll see where you go with that, but that part of that perspective comes out of an attempt to get outside of American customs and perspectives. So a big part of my training, but also what I do in my death and dying class is, like first thing is let's get out of America and think about attitudes toward death in other cultures and in other historical periods. And then things look different. When you start coming back to America, things that are clearly distinctive about American society, but also some sort of basic uh, patterns that are obvious in any time or place. I think
Yeah.
I'm quickly saying,
No, no, go ahead.
that I think every culture is fixated and obsessed with death. I mean, death is an engine for cultural production and expression and cultural life across time and through, across cultures. So anyway, you get to some primal kind of basic stuff that helps to put some of these distinctive peculiarities of American practices and attitudes into a different framework.
Yeah, well, I really loved when I was reading the book what you just said about how when students come into your class and they think they know about everything about death, but it's really from generally that American and often Christian bubble that, is dominant within the culture, right? And I think you said like first thing you do is tell people, okay, we're going to learn about death outside of the US and also outside of Christianity, right? Like so go explore what the Hindus or the various Chinese religions or Muslim or Islam has to say about death, and then we'll come back and unpeel the onion, so to speak.
That's right. Absolutely. Although I would say certainly my classes now have a much broader, more diverse range of religious backgrounds and perspectives than, well, even whatever, 7, 10 years ago. Um, but still, the point remains to really um, try to disorient them, which is what I
Yeah,
try to do in every class, disorient them from what they think they know about, as you're saying, Christianity, kind of mainstream perspectives on death and how people respond to death by, yeah, thinking about indigenous American cultures or Buddhist practices and so on. It enriches, even if it is, at least in my classroom experience, very a quick kind of surveying of different cultural contexts. But in terms of my own work, for sure, that effort to broaden out and think comparatively helped to shape my own little take on death in American history and culture.
now, is there any region or culture or group that you think stands out that's worth mentioning that contrasts or compares really well to the American paradigm around death that you think's like worth mentioning? I'm just curious if there's anybody that really stands out that's like not American, but hey, this is pretty cool or very different from the classic American bubble.
There's so many. I mean, this is part of the joy of studying death is just this is just so fascinating to be exposed to different cultures through death, through the lens of death. And it points to, on the one hand, the, as I was saying about America, the sort of total uniqueness and distinctiveness of different cultures, but then again, sort of ties back to some common universal questions and themes that get answered differently in different cultural contexts. So, I mean, think of some communities, some Buddhist communities will, as part of their meditative practices, contemplative practices, will go into a graveyard and meditate on a decomposing corpse. I mean, that would be pretty good contrast for America. Just that kind of the spiritual value of contemplating our mortality, and not just in some abstract way, but like looking and being in the presence of the disintegrating body. Um, it's not unique to Buddhism. There are other religious communities that do similar things, but we don't really meditate directly on the reality of death like some cultures and subcultures do. Although
No,
you can
that's
see, sorry, my poster in the back is a concert poster for my favorite band, Wilco, and one that struck my eye immediately and that I purchased. But some of us have a little more macabre sensibility, I suppose, and certainly, you know, that's a reality too. It's hard to make generalizations about America because you can bet within America there are subcultures that are very seriously kind of tied into that kind of death-focused consciousness, however graphic or sensational it might be.
No, that's true. It's hard to paint, such a big country with broad strokes. So I'm glad you pointed that out. Yeah, I think
Well,
it's a fair point that at least the people I interact with definitely don't ponder death with a dead body in front of them. It's more abstract if they're thinking about it at all. It's a mental exercise versus a I'm going to go be around dying people or people that have passed to, you know, assist my practice, I guess, if you will, in reflecting upon death.
sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the prevailing attitude for most people is to keep it in the abstract and not, really face some of the more, um, well, yeah, I mean, bodily aspects of death, whether we're talking about decomposing corpses or, working in hospices or something. Um, Although, there are plenty of people, thank God, who do work intimately with dying and dead bodies, um, so that we don't have to. But on another level, for sure, of consciousness, these reflections are evident, even if they aren't so aligned, in proximity to the physical material realities of death. So you can find evidence of that, as I try to do again in the class, by um, talking about something we all share and is an integral part of all of our lives, and that's music. And when I get students to start paying attention to the music they listen to and to pull out, songs that they're dealing with death, their grief, or, violence and death of some kind, to send them in to me. And I have compiled a Spotify playlist of death and dying songs that is massive, near probably, I don't know, it's nearly 1,000 songs. But anyway, the point is students, by the end of that exercise, by the end of the semester, are fully cognizant of how pervasive, reflections on death, descriptions of death are are uh, found in music, and you could do the same thing with film and literature. Again, tying into this theme of how central death is to cultural life in so many ways.
So I'm glad you brought that up because it was a bullet I had here. I think of music and death in twofold: songs that are literally about death, and then songs that might be well suited to help me endure or process, a
Mhm.
death that's taken place. Do you make it when you ask the students to gather that stuff? Is it more, hey, go find music that the message is clear about death, or is it, hey, go find music that makes you think of death or that would be useful to you while experiencing the death of somebody? What's the assignment there?
That's an interesting pedagogical point that you are raising. that will cause me to confess about some of my own biases in the classroom and classes like this, death and dying, that are so fraught, so heavy. Um, and so, yeah, to answer your question, I don't want to go anywhere near personal feelings,
Mm.
not in my classes. I just don't. It's all intellectual. It's all trying to analyze reflectively. Now, believe me, I know that it's impossible to separate out those things, for sure. So, but I'm very explicit about the space of the class, and most of my classes are virtual, and so it's a very different kind of um, teaching modality than if it were if it was in person. But nonetheless, there is with my class on death, with my class on sexuality, with my class now on drugs. I always make it clear to students that this is not about in any explicit primary way about their personal issues and
Yeah.
personal struggles. A byproduct of the courses may be actually very directly related to how they think about death or their identity or whatever. But yeah, this is like intellectual, historical, anthropological. Let's learn about the study of religion. And so that subjective side of it, I tend to keep out. So that's the answer to your question, is only things that are like really pretty explicit, even metaphorical for sure, but keep it on that level.
Well, yeah, no, I mean I'm glad that you shared that with me because like I feel like if you open it up to the subjective, like God, it would be pretty hard to get through a class too, because everybody would want to share their individual feelings about, and it would turn into, it would just detract from the general theme of class, it would seem.
But yeah, well, for me, I mean, some professors are much more comfortable opening that door.
Well, I mean, it makes sense to me, at least as keeping it intellectual. There's a time and a place for the feelings, and a time and place for more intellectual stuff. So
Yeah,
you brought something up though. I don't want to pivot hard away from music, but I think it's peripherally related. Not just music, but in the entertainment we consume in general. Getting familiar with your work, you seem to have a focus on Disney and death, and sharing some insights about the correlation between the two. I'm wondering if maybe you can uh, just present some of the key themes as it relates to your analysis of Disney and death.
sure. Yeah. I'll keep it short. um, but I'll try to give a little more context. When I decided I was going to write my second book as a sequel to the first book that looked at death in 19th century America, the follow-up, the sequel, which became Rest in Peace, was a book that I wasn't planning to write, but thought, I was compelled to write after I finished the first one, The Sacred Remains. So when I knew I was going to write Rest in Peace, which was going to look at death in the 20th century, the first thought that came to my mind was the movie Bambi and the death of Bambi's mother. Now, that may date me to some degree, but that film, and seeing the death of Bambi's mother in that film, freaked me and a whole generation of people out, and maybe still freaks generations out, and just that drama, and just the horror of that um, in a kid's film. So, that was like, okay, something's going on there. And so that led me just to think, well, does death show up in other Disney films? And I'm talking about, the films that Walt Disney made while he was alive. So it's not like getting to The Lion King or some of the more recent Disney films. It's, when the company started and the whole first generation from whatever, the 30s, 40s, 50s into the 60s.
Mhm.
Um, so I dug into it and I started watching movies of those, of those kinds of movies. And it was clear that death was um, not just present, but often a driver in those films. There seemed to be, if you will, an obsession with with death, whether it's the fear of death, the reality of death, death of separation, or kind of artificial death with Sleeping Beauty, who ate that apple and was in that glass casket. Um, so some really compelling and macabre and very direct kind of confrontations with death in these films. In the movie Fantasia, the sequence with Mazursky's Night on Bald Mountain. What is that? It's the evil dead raising from the cemetery in the night and starting to haunt and attack the small little community. Um, this is again the 19. I think that was 1950s. Pinocchio, the little wooden boy, who dies but then is resurrected as a little boy. Um, so everywhere. Then just quickly, I also thought, well, what is up with Walt Disney? And does this have anything to do with maybe him and his story? And I've found, yes, man, the dude was totally obsessed with death. Had all kinds of encounters with death that made him fear it. And so, in the man, the creator himself, and in the product, of his creations, cultural creations, I think, um, get exposed to a kind of underlying strain of American culture, which is this, another piece of evidence for not an avoidance, denial, but of a, kind of engagement with death through popular culture, through entertainment. And and that's not trivial. Part of the story that I won't start off going off on here is, there's in some ways entertainment replaces or displaces religion as a sacred source for people's meaning making and sense of identity and sense of right and wrong and what they should value. And you can bet these Disney films have been, monumental in shaping and reflecting these kinds of more um, broad-based American religious sensibilities. And so those films to me capture that. Um, and 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 death is an interesting, again, lens with which to highlight some of that stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that it's both influencing our cultural perspectives on death, but then reflecting too. It's like a reciprocal machine going on. It's not just a one-way street, right?
That's my perspective. Some people have very different perspectives, but I like to think about that sort of, as you said, the sort of mutuality of that. And it, isn't just power structures on top that are brainwashing everyone to think in certain ways. And it's not just the popular will that is, kind of determining more public collective attitudes. But, it's a mixture of things going on for sure.
Yeah, no, it seems to resonate with me that it would be a feedback loop of
Yes, yes.
a minimum. Well, something else that you wrote about. I'm going to take kind of a hard pivot away from culture and entertainment, but maybe shift our focus over to the physical body and how we view that with death. In your book, you talked a lot about. You focused almost as a case study on Abraham Lincoln and his death in the Civil War, and kind of the introduction of like, and keep me honest here, like the whole concept of embalming the body and that becoming a widespread practice in this country. Can you open maybe elaborate on that for people to understand how that took off?
Sure, that's a big pivot, not just in terms of our conversation, but the story of Abraham Lincoln itself is a pivot historically in the longer history of death in America. So yeah, you nailed it right on the nose. Um, and I'll be a little kind of over dramatic, but before the Civil War, there's no embalming. There's no funeral homes, right? After the Civil War, embalming becomes the cornerstone of the funeral industry that grows out of uh, funeral homes that start to pop up in the late 19th and early 20th century. So the Civil War itself is, I think, the key kind of social event that helps to transform the landscape of death. But Lincoln and his body is, is the story, and it was a part of this book was my dissertation, and so I got a lot of play out of this story because it's one that people had forgotten or that hadn't really thought about in a religious context, and not simply Protestant context, right? So quickly, it's just the fact that Lincoln was assassinated and his body was embalmed, and it was embalmed um, for a number of reasons, but primarily because it was going to be put on a train and be presented publicly in different cities along the way, and taking the body back home. So, the journey from Washington, D.C. back to Springfield, Illinois. And so, the magnitude of his murder and death was very much, kind of embodiment of the conflict and the division that was taking place in the Civil War and for the nation. Um, so there were clear interests in making sure that the public presentation of the president's body um, had the appearance of coherence, um, had an appearance that didn't show signs of disintegration, but that was held together and was viewable to people to see the body's integrity. And so I try to align that with the larger kind of cultural, political symbolism, clearly critical at this time around the notion of the body politic. And so with the end of the Civil War, there was also the concern to try to make the social body whole and ensure its integrity. And so there's this interesting parallel between the representational value of Lincoln's body and the political realities of that moment. Part of the story is, of course, that the embalming doesn't hold up. There are signs of disintegration and blackness on his body, on his face, which is mainly what people are looking at. So, the descriptions and reviews get mixed. But for my story, what's interesting here is that the media did not hold back. They were covering this embalmer that was traveling with Lincoln's body to try to make sure at each stop things were looking okay.
Yeah.
As well as the kind of the techniques that were used to embalm his body. So, it's a very dramatic shift in terms of public consciousness around embalming and what we do with the dead, from before the Civil War to after the Civil War.
So what did people do before the Civil War? Like I have no idea what the common practice was. No embalming? You just bury people quickly, or was you know cremations popular? Or I just don't even understand.
Yeah, no cremations for sure. I mean, there's really only one option, and that was interment, getting the body in the ground. Usually, it would be done quickly, as you say, within 2 or 3 days. Um, and it was a family and community affair. There was a great deal of, as I tried to describe, intimacy around the dead body that was a part of family life and a part of the local, again, sort of communal life. So there were people who stepped in to help the family and help prepare the dead. And the dead were generally kept in people's homes, at least for a short time, before they were brought to often a church or a meeting house for some kind of funeral ceremony of some kind, often. But then they would be directed to the local graveyard, churchyard, cemetery, where they would be interred. So, um, everything about death was different before the Civil War, not just our practices and our intimacy with the dead, but also just some of the basic demographic facts. Mortality rates were insane. Death was everywhere. People, infant mortality was sky high. Uh, you know, People had extended families. We're not talking about the nuclear family kind of setup. So, again, death was a part of the fabric of life, to sound a little corny. Um, and then, I mean, just if I may, and then the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, embalming, and the funeral industry. And then, as I write in the book, there is a kind of intimacy lost. The dead are sequestered. They are taken care of by this new professional class of people who have expertise, to take the dead off of your hands. And so that's part of a, I think, pretty dramatic, radical cultural shift around not just our relationship with the dead, but also the dying. But that may be another, again, tangent.
Well, I mean, it's interesting, right? It's the beginning of outsourcing something that used to be very.
Sure.
I mean, I imagine it would be almost really helpful for the healing process, the acceptance process, to be intimately involved with that, right? Like, I don't know. Obviously, I can't say from firsthand experience, but um, it's
Sure.
not. Yeah, you're now stepping back, and just it's not even something people do.
Yes. Yes. And I try to, include that into the argument that goes against um, the usual condemnation of the funeral industry as being exploitative, as um, profiting off of people's grief, of imposing all kinds of um, practices and sort of uh, commodities in the funeral experience. But I try to write as well that people were more than willing to let someone step in, and take care of their dead, to take the dead off of their hands, so that they didn't have that intimacy. And for whatever changes that were happening in American society in the late 19th and the early 20th century, industrialization, urbanization, all kinds of changes in sort of workforce, I mean, it was outsourcing and kind of niche entrepreneurialism, you know,
Again,
combination.
it's a two way street, right? It's a
Right, right,
reflection of society, and
right,
not wanting to step away, and then someone coming to fill that void almost.
right. Well, yeah, again, it is complicated, and there was exploitation and kind of maneuvering for sure, but it's yeah, it's a mix.
So do you feel that way? We talked about the dead body, but how do you feel about dying people like that aren't dead, or do you feel that same sentiment is there in American culture of wanting to step away from people undergoing the dying process, or do you think that there's still a lot of desire or willingness to be involved in that capacity?
There is a great historical story that's there that speaks directly to how our society has changed its attitudes and um, practices around the dying, not even thinking about the dead. Um, but I would throw out there that in a parallel fashion to the rise of the funeral home after the Civil War and in the early 20th century, a so-called profession that emerges, becomes kind of institutionalized, but that is based on this um, stepping in and becoming mediators between the living and the dead. Simultaneous to that emergence and parallel to it is the rise of the modern hospital. Right? Before the Civil War, there aren't hospitals in the way we understand them today.
Right.
And people didn't go to hospitals to die. But after the Civil War, hospitals, for all kinds of reasons, again, become institutionally set up to create this mediation between the living and the dying. And again, this is part of the argument for the taboo, and the sort of denial of death and dying and the realities of death, is that doctors and nurses step in, the dying are sequestered, into hospital rooms, away from family and the living, and there isn't that intimacy, but professional, expert class of healers are in there, and um, assuming a whole different set of responsibilities and doing everything they can to deny death, to save the dying. So at least historically, in the first half of the 20th century, for sure, we didn't have much to do with the dying. They were institutionally separated from people. I mean, that's changed dramatically in the last few decades, but it's a characteristic of American society and 20th century American society, for sure, that feeds into this complexity of our attitudes toward medicine, the body, suffering, dying, the dead, and so on.
So this leads me to a question I didn't have planned, but when you talked about your interest in like plant medicine and stuff, or I think that's what you said earlier, plant medicines, or is it related to psychedelics potentially? But your
Well,
or
actually,
religion? Sorry, go ahead.
no, sorry. Well, I mean, I'm calling what I am interested in writing about just religion and drugs.
Okay,
So
religion.
psychedelics is in there as a part of a larger psychoactive spectrum.
Okay, fair enough. So candidly, that triggered a thought about psychedelics to me because, one of the things you write about your book is 5 things for baby boomers to consider, I guess, as they get older and death is coming. And, one of the things that helped me as a not baby boomer, but like think about death and experience death was a psychedelic experience that produced ego death. And that really changed my relationship to death. I'm wondering if you have any perspectives, one on psychedelics and almost maybe using those as a preparation for death in a sense, or if that's just not really tangible because it's ego death and you come back, um, so it's not the same as truly preparing for death. But then I also, after you comment on that, I would love if you could speak to the things that you wrote about in your book about things that baby boomers should consider, um, as death approaches, basically.
Well, I'm writing about this, thinking about this, but so are so many other people, and so much of this medical research on psychedelics in terms of their potential for medical um, treatment and healing is tied into this, kind of the mystical experience, to use an overused word that is problematic, but still this sort of element that is seen as a sort of integral to psychedelic experiences. And um, so other people are seeing this, other, again, medical researchers are kind of seeing that connection, and there being studies happening now that look at the impact of psychedelics on death anxiety. So all of this is incredible, because it is becoming so legitimized.
Mhm.
And so psychedelics are entering into the mainstream. And there's a lot one can say, but from my perspective, that has all kinds of religious implications. Um, and, what could be more central, as we've talked about, to religious life than death? The kernel, to me, for all of religion,
Yeah.
is based on human uh, encounter and with death, and trying to figure out what to do with it. Um, so so what's interesting is, kind of religion generally has been the resource for helping people cope with death anxiety, right? Because they've got stories of heaven and hell and reincarnation and all that. And now we're seeing psychedelics in a very explicit way, kind of being an important resource for people to deal with their death anxiety that isn't necessarily tied to the church or the synagogue or the temple or some sacred scripture, but instead is based on the experience of ego death. However that gets sort of worked into that process. In again, I'm thinking more in terms of the medical research that's being done. Um, so that dynamic, even though we want to talk about psychedelics primarily in terms of their therapeutic value, the clinical kind of research around it, they are religious through and through, and the religious uh, implications of our embrace of psychedelics, I think, are going to be profound.
Yeah, it certainly seems to be entering the mainstream more and more, right? Like we got places like Hopkins, Harvard, Imperial College in London. Like it's definitely taken a foothold. I've seen it, most prominently with, MDMA, for which I don't know, I don't know if that necessarily psychedelic, but for
Mhm.
treatment resistant PTSD, right? I think that was the big thing that got people started. And then, it's kind of like coming back to the Richard Alpert, Timothy Leary, Good Friday experiment, where psilocybin's now being like brought back
Right.
into the mix. And I think specifically for what you mentioned as like helping relieve anxiety for people approaching death or with terminal diseases. And it
Yes.
does seem like the medical community is going to, or the hospital group that you mentioned that really emerged as catering and caring for the dying, they're going to be getting more hip to this as time goes on.
Absolutely. And then there too, it could be transformative in terms of medicine, in terms of how we think about caring for the dying, and terminally ill. But then again, as you were saying for yourself, outside of clinical trial, uh, in your own personal experiences, as we all have had, or so many of us are having, outside of, again, the official Hopkins trials or so on and so on, um, is that, I won't call it underground. It's all above ground, but the sort of more non-medical setting where these religious um, consequences and possibilities associated with psychedelics are still operating, are still influencing. But again, in this broader context where we're all like, thumbs up, I'm ready for ketamine, and or whatever, people are turning to. And I mean, it's definitely making an impact in ways that are spilling over what the medical research, clinical research is showing. Um, and so that too, I think has some interesting implications and possibilities for religious life and spiritual life in America today and into the future.
Yeah, I mean, well, for one, personally, I'm glad that it's entering the public consciousness, especially for people at the end of life. But I'll be curious to see how it evolves in the mainstream, as people go outside of, you know, uh, uh, official trials, and it becomes something that people do earlier in life. Because, I mean, for me to experience ego death, I'm 35 now, and to have experienced it where I really thought my sense of self was dying, um, it renewed me in a lot of ways for how I want to carry on, the next chapters of my life. And
Yeah.
so I know that's not literal death, but I've certainly experienced, a psychological death and death of patterns of behavior that don't suit me via that mechanism. And I know there's other ways to do it, not just with psychedelics, like the Buddhists do meditation and,
Right.
all kinds of practices out there. But yeah, it's something to keep an eye on for sure, I guess.
Oh, yeah, it's where my eye is. Both eyes are now focused on this interesting religious world that is connected with drug use.
Yeah, and Americans love drugs. We know that. That's always been the case, and probably won't ever go away.
That's what I'm saying. And not just Americans, this is deep rooted in human cultures and human evolution. That's part of the
Yeah,
fun. Go.
no, it seems to be the case that, as far back as you can find people, there's been substance ingestion, right? It's not like it's something that just popped up in the 60s, right? This
Right.
is like intimately tied to our evolution as a species.
Right. Well, and even beyond humans, right? I mean, that's part of the, kind of for many jarring uh, realities of the presence of drugs in human evolution, is of course that animals will also um, voluntarily, seemingly go and seek out drugging substances, fermented fruits, and so on. So you can see everything from elephants to dolphins to insects. And this has all been, not just conjecture by philosophers, but, actual evolutionary biologists and scientists who study animal behavior. I mean, that tells us something. And people have jumped off on that springboard and made arguments that maybe our desire for intoxication is a primal human instinct.
Yeah, we're
And,
not
and
so special in that, right? I've heard of and seen, dolphins pass around the puffer fish, right? And the toxin that comes from those poor puffer fish getting passed around. But yeah, it seems everywhere. I've heard people talk about like even I haven't looked into this, so I won't like rubber stamp it as true. But the reindeer in Siberia eating the Amanita muscaria mushroom, and that's maybe where the Santa Claus myth and the flying reindeer comes
that's
from.
that's
Um,
yeah, this it gets trippy. What can you say when you really start exploring yeah, just historically, how people have used these substances and how they again relate to animal behaviors. That's another one in the sort of mythology of drug use, is thinking about the dancing goats and coffee. Is again another animal human connection, but even without the animals, it's again it's ubiquitous and for many people. a catalyst, in terms of human evolution and shifts in consciousness and brain chemistry, whatever, like that these substances may have been the catalyst for some aspects of human change and human development. Um, so there are all kinds of interesting kind of theories about the role of psychoactive substances in human evolution. But I don't think there's a question that it's present. And then certainly as civilizations and other, human cultures really begin to take shape, that the presence remains, even as history progresses.
Yeah, no, it's never going away, it seems. Speaking of going away, I know we're at time, but I'm wondering if I could keep you for maybe one or two more questions. That's all right.
Sure, sure. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, since we're on the theme of plants, religion, psychedelics, I feel like it would be a missed opportunity to ask if, in your studies right now, as you're preparing for this book, like, and especially related to death, people have brought up for a while now. I think it got popular with Dr. Rick Strassman, but many years ago, DMT, the spirit molecule. People say that the brain secretes DMT when you're dying, and obviously can be used as a recreational or spiritual psychedelic now. Have you come across that in your works?
Well, with Strassman, and a lot of interest in near-death experiences and trying to figure those out. So in the class, we've spent some time on near-death experiences and the different kinds of theories about what takes place. So, that's in itself a very kind of interesting theory around that particular the DMT story. I think is one that serves to sort of break down our kind of common assumptions around death, around drugs, around the body itself. So I've talked with Strassman, and I think that uh, contribution has really helped set the stage for what we're in right now, which is this psychedelic renaissance.
No doubt hugely influential, especially because he seemingly somehow did that when the war on drugs was like at its height and you couldn't really test anything, but he
Yes.
somehow found a way to get that study done.
Yeah. And as we're saying, it really was instrumental. Maybe it not such a explicit, not in such an explicit way, but instrumental in getting us where we are today.
Yeah, well, Rick Strassman, if you ever watched this, big thank you for sure for helping catalyze the psychedelic renaissance, much needed, in my opinion. Um, Gary, one last thing, if I can, coming back to the book and pivoting away from psychedelics, you mentioned five things for baby boomers to consider, and I figured that might be a good send off for us. Could you maybe, at a high level, I'm sure we could go into it for a while, but could you maybe just talk about that? What you think might be important for baby boomers to think about as relates to death?
Oh, well, there are so many things, and I don't know if I can just sort of, do it, in terms of those five
It doesn't
explicit.
doesn't
But,
have to be the five.
yeah, yeah, no, but I mean, I think, that it's already happening. Baby boomers are not just thinking about death, but experiencing it with whatever, parents, friends, all kinds of realities that bring mortality to mind in a way that didn't exist, in the younger years of that generation, of my generation. Um, so, I think that's going to require some shifts in attitudes. And, you know, part of that shift again ties into a movement that's already taking place, which is um, these efforts to create conversations around death, death cafes and all kinds of death podcasts and reading groups, and there's a lot of sort of organic um, movement to find ways to encounter death. Embrace it might seem a bit strong, but to at least find ways to confront it. And I think another point here is the power of the social, like, the confrontation and engagement with death um, is, how do I want to put it? It's more, I don't want to say more anything, as opposed to just individually reflecting and contemplating death, talking about it and being kind of socially engaged in ways that don't allow you to go too far down your own grief rabbit hole. But instead, through articulation and conversation, keep it at some level, a kind of intellectual exercise. That again is helpful. I don't think there's any way. That's another thing I'll say is that I don't think there's any way to prepare for death and how it hits. However religious you are, or committed you are, or intellectually, um, you know, involved in the study of death. Like there's no real preparation, but that doesn't mean it's not worth it to try to prepare, whether that is through reading about death or um, working at a hospice or, finding ways to reflect and talk with others about death. That also is key. Um, Another point, and maybe I'll make this the last one, is death. In my experience, in my studies, in my perspective, death inspires religious life, and so that gets me in a lot of trouble with atheists. But I think that there is a kind of sacred power to death that inspires people, whether it's to, be a member of a church or a synagogue or a mosque, um, or it inspires people to study science and think about the finality of death, that there is no beyond. I mean, even that is a religious kind of position in terms of making sense of our lives and the shortness of life and the meaning of life. Um, so there's value in that engagement with death and thinking about, your own cosmic understanding of what death may mean, and that we can't avoid thinking about death. You can't not think about death, right? Um, and my sense is, uh, just especially coming out of we're not out of it, but experiencing the pandemic, and just the world that we're in now. There's a heightened awareness of death, not just for baby boomers, but there's a way in which it's weighing on so many people, in ways that I just don't think it did before the pandemic. And, there are different periods for sure of history when death weighs more heavily on the individual and on society. But they're infrequent to some degree. But I think we're in that moment now. And yeah, I want to believe that, as I said, there's value in thinking about death and working through that, again, hopefully not just internally by yourself, but with others via psychedelics, via, death cafes and so on. And that ultimately, yeah, having that level of engagement and confrontation can only nurture feelings of love and empathy and compassion, is it's my hope, because we know that's not the reality for so many people, and for too many people, the death actually turns into anger, negativity, hatreds, and other things that are destructive. Um, but yeah, facing death can be also liberating, and again, hopefully transformative in how we relate to other people, which ultimately, regardless of how much money we make or whatever kind of accomplishments we have, is sort of our lives are the sum of our interactions with people, and to understand the limitations and, sort of mortal framework around that, I think, again, can be humanizing.
Well, I think that was remarkably well said, and a great way to kind of close this out here. I hope that people watching this can be one of those things for people to help with their socializing and considering of death in a way that makes their life richer and more peaceful and happy. You're right. I mean, for me, the whole memento mori, be mindful of death, makes me realize time's short. Love the people who are around you and who have been a part of your life, and seek to have rich relationships. And yeah, you can't actually no one's ever gonna there's nothing you can do to be fully ready for it, but thinking about death can help you maybe not be as scared because you made the most of life, and tried to be as good as you could to other people in the process.
There you go. Right on. Another, I don't know exactly what I said, but I nailed it, and also was quite articulate in this sort of shared, perspective on what we've been talking about.
Well, this is great, Gary. I just want to thank you again for being here, for being a resource for people to consider death, and I hope that everybody that watches this enjoys it as much as I did. It was a real pleasure and honor to have you on here. So thanks again for jumping on and joining.
It's mutual. Honors mine as well. I appreciated the invitation, and I totally enjoyed the conversation.